Maplestory has remained a beloved game for 2 decades, dating all the way back to 2003. With the rising popularity of MMORPGs in the early 2000s, Maplestory withstood the test of time with its charming 2D pixel graphics, jam-packed and seemingly endless gameplay, and most importantly, its sense of community and camaraderie amongst players across nations. But underneath all the Henny-Ho NX and Guild Wars lies a different type of community. One that took no prisoners and snatched victims left and right, including yours truly. We're talking about the scams within Maplestory. I want to give a small disclaimer and state that I'm mainly going to be going over scams from the earlier days of Maplestory, but I've sprinkled in a couple recent ones for good measure. If I've left anything out, feel free to let me know in the comments. With that out of the way, let's get into it. Starting off on a smaller scale, the boss trade scam is pretty simple. 2 players promise to carry each other's mains or mules through bosses, but one player won't keep their end of the deal, and just take the carry and sign off into the sunset never to be heard of again. Like the other schemes we'll take a look at, the scammer will have alleged vouches to build initial trust with the other player. Now, as far as anecdotes go, I was only really able to find this post on Reddit dated back to last year, explaining their experience being scammed out of a carry. As mentioned before, this scam is pretty straightforward and simple, and there's really not much to it. I haven't personally seen this scam happen to anybody I know, but if you have, then let me know. I'm curious to see if this scam is more prevalent than I'm thinking it is. Some scammers prey on people looking to upgrade equips but are unable to due to their lack of resources. There are many ways to upgrade these equips to add better stats, including cubing or scrolling. If a player doesn't have the supplies to improve their items, they can simply seek out another player willing to provide them with upgrading services. One player will be selling these upgrade services to another for X amount of in-game currency called mesos, and the buyer will trade over their items with payment and the scammer will steal the items and leave. Service and boss trades are a couple of scams that are still used today, but now we'll take a look at some older techniques players have used to swindle others. Fame in Maplestory is a great way to show off to other players how cool and popular your character is, and it's been around for pretty much all of the game's history. The concept is represented by a number in your character UI, next to up and down arrows to raise or lower someone's fame count, which can actually go into the negatives. Fame was super important back then, as some equips required a certain amount of fame to be able to wear, in addition to really bringing you to a higher social status in the pixelated hierarchy. Unfortunately, some players found an easy way to raise their fame by tricking unsuspecting players into faming them for free. A player would say something like buying fame or trading fame, and a player would agree to fame them for a return, usually mesos or relying on the other player to fame them back. As most of these scams go, the scammer would receive their free fame and immediately disconnect from the game without giving the other player their promised payout. If you're confused about any of this, here's a 2009 video explaining exactly how the scam works. Thank you, user uncreated88. I've definitely sold fame back in the day and was scammed about half the time. Now, we're going to start diving into some more intense scams. NX stands for Nexon Cash, and with this cash you can buy cosmetic items or other in-game items to massively help a player progress through the game. The only real way to get NX is by purchasing it with IRL money on the official website or by redeeming coupon codes, which are also bought with cold hard cash. These Nexon game cards can be bought at local grocery or convenience stores, and like any other gift card, they have a unique coupon code on the back that can be redeemed to your account, but players invented ways to scam using these codes. The desire for cosmetic or progressive items was and still is pretty high, so it wasn't super hard to find victims. Typically, one of the two parties would be buying or selling NX coupon codes, and the scammer would initiate either a Maple chat or a trade. The set prices were often in the tens or hundreds of millions, which was a ton of Meso back then. Most of the time, the scammer would just make up a code consisting of random letters and numbers to give to the buyer after accepting payment. Or in other cases, the buyer would be provided with a very real code that was already used and be told to just keep trying. Then, as pretty much every other entry will go, the fraudster would just sign off or change channels. Now, Maplestory used to have a feature in the game called /find, where you can find the exact channel and map any player in the game was currently at with their username following the command. Since these scammers would normally sign off, the game would just end up showing text saying, "Unable to find insert player name here." I believe this feature was removed around 2018, but don't quote me on that. /find was used to track players of all sorts, especially people suspected of scamming, which will come back up in the rest of the entries. There was also a big scandal in 2006 regarding Nexon cash fraud, in which people were using illegal methods of charging NX by using stolen credit cards and fraudulent information on PayPal accounts. The NX would then be sold to other players in-game, resulting in banned accounts left and right of sellers and buyers, in addition to tons of chargebacks from the people who had their information stolen. Nexon would eventually end up paying hefty fines to these credit card companies, and they were rightly furious, which we'll talk about a little bit later. In the earlier years of Maplestory, most of its player base was teens and children with no access to credit cards or money, thus making the idea of being able to buy NX by trading for in-game items or mesos a really appealing one. A harsh reality of being a consumer is that sometimes one isn't always a smart consumer. Anyone can make claims, and it's up to you to do your due diligence and research what you're actually putting money or your account info or credit card details into. There are websites out there that claim to load your Maplestory account with mesos or NX. Some of these websites are advertised in-game with botters spamming messages such as these. Now, I will say that not every website claiming to give you riches was a scam, but for most people that were trusting of these sites, they were often met with a very unlucky fate. Some sites would disguise themselves as meso generators, where all you had to do was input your account details, including all passwords or PINs, and they promised to deposit as many mesos into your account as your heart desired. Other websites had you input your credit card information or send payment through PayPal to purchase mesos or other goods, taking your money and just never delivering. In other cases, some victims directly downloaded third-party programs disguised as meso or item generators that either resulted in their accounts being banned or they ended up downloading some sort of virus to their family PCs. And I ain't talking about this Trojan. Trade scams are simple in concept, but very convoluted in practice. These types of scams take advantage of the trade feature, which allows you to trade items and mesos with other players and has a chat function to communicate with the player you're trading with. Grab a drink and settle in because we're going to be looking at a few different examples here. The free market, or FM for short, was the hotspot for investors, entrepreneurs, and Maple business majors alike. Every Maple veteran knows screenshots such as these, and it truly was a place with vast opportunity to buy and sell valuable in-game items and ball out. The endless chat bubbles of players buying and selling items is definitely one of the most popular memories of old-school Maplestory, which was unfortunately overtaken by features such as the auction house once the free market was shut down in 2018. But not every trade scam occurred in the free market, as sometimes they can happen in other highly populated maps around the Maple world, and our first example is a perfect display of just that. Amidst the spam messages and botters were seemingly normal messages scattered about that stood out because these people were scammers allegedly buying items at inflated prices. These scammers will say something like, buying Steely 8 mil, and another player will trade them. Then the player will put up the correct amount agreed upon. They will either cancel the trade straight up and claim it was the other person's fault, or have a full inventory, which automatically does not allow the trade to be completed. They'll do this over and over again until the final time they'll tell the victim, hurry up, be faster, creating a sense of urgency. The other player will put up their item, waiting for the mesos to appear in the trade, and then at the very last second, the scammer will put up one number less than agreed upon, making the victim accidentally accept the trade for an entire digit less. In this case, we can see the player thinks they're getting 7.7 million for their throwing stars, but unfortunately they only receive 777,777. This was an awful way to be scammed, along with the next trade scam in which I personally fell victim to and never financially or emotionally recovered from. I've been most excited to talk about this next topic as it's one of my favorites because it's, in my opinion, the most ridiculous. Along with NX being extremely sought after, so was the quest for equips and meso. And in this quest for goods, scammers found a way to profit off the ignorance and greed of players. The Tab trade scam was genius because it didn't require as much effort as some of the other schemes and typically only needed you to trade once or twice and bank on the fact that nobody would really fact check the validity or question the technique. As you probably understand by now, Maplers were a very trusting bunch of children. The Tab scam worked like this. One player would trade another player and convince them that they could duplicate their items or mesos as long as they placed them into the trade UI and followed a certain set of steps. Once placing the items, they would instruct the player to press Tab Alt Enter or Tab Space Enter to complete the duplication. Unfortunately, pressing Tab twice and then Enter results in an automatic acceptance of the trade, and players lost their items forever. I personally have been a victim of this and was devastated when I accidentally gave away my level 10 items and beginner sword. I, as every other player, tried to find the scammer but was unable to because their username was something along the lines of VVWVWVVWV, which probably should have been my first red flag. Another variant of this scam was instead of asking players to press enter, the scammer would tell the player to type something like Maplestory or I love Maplestory or anything that ended in a Y because pressing Y in Maplestory registers as Yosh. So when the prompt asking if you'd like to trade would pop up, the victim would accept the trade as soon as the letter Y was typed. Looking back, this seems unbelievable to fall for, but you'd be surprised at how many victims were caught up in this scam. Another way people used trade scams involved a friend or guildmate. I'm not sure how prevalent this specific one was, but I thought it would be interesting to mention anyway. Two people would be in the free market, player A claiming to be selling an item for an inflated price and player B claiming to be buying that exact item for an even higher price. An unsuspecting player would think to themselves, hey, maybe I can flip this item and make a quick buck. So they buy the item at the inflated price and immediately try to trade player B, but by this point, player A and player B have signed off with their shared riches. Trade scams overall were pretty genius because they took advantage of the naivety of players, and with it being the earlier days of the internet, people really didn't have as many quick, on-hand resources to research these scams. It's been years since I've heard of this happening to anyone, so if someone out there has any personal anecdotes, feel free to drop a comment. We're finally on to the entry that I consider being the most iconic of all, Drop Game. This scam had people all over the Maple world in complete shambles because it was devastating to unknowingly compete in a game that was completely rigged from the start. Now, the Drop Game isn't necessarily always a scam, as there are tons of instances in which the game was played regularly with two honest players, but in the olden days of Maplestory, it wasn't uncommon to fall prey to this scheme. We'll get into some of those reasons later, but for now let's get into the main topics. There are two main ways to be scammed in the Drop Game. The first method was an entire operation and usually included two scammers. Again, we'll call them player A and player B, with the unsuspecting victim being player C. Player A would convince player C to participate in this so-called Drop Game. which consisted of each player taking turns dropping items or mesos from their inventory of increasing value onto whatever map they're on. This would usually happen in smaller maps like the Kerning City Self-Defense Store or the main town's general or department stores. Player A would establish the rules of the game beforehand, as the drop game can either be played stoically or as an actual active game. So as they're taking turns dropping items, the two players would try to quickly jump around the map and loot those items from underneath each other, and this would go on for a few rounds. Then, Player A will convince Player C to drop their most valuable items until all of a sudden, Player B would appear from the shadows and loot all of Player C's precious equips, and the two scammers would be gone in a flash. Player A and B would usually be in an in-game party or have a private chat called a whisper going so they can secretly relay instructions to each other. As the frauds leave the map, Player C is left shattered and confused, and in some cases, naked and afraid. A second variant of the drop game scam didn't usually involve a third player, but a third party. A third-party hack, to be exact. We are talking about the tried and true VAC hack. VAC hacking was rampant in older Maplestory, and these hackers ran wild and of course discovered a new way to abuse this directly with other players. For drop games specifically, the hacker would again convince a player to participate in the game, but instead of having a friend loot the items, they would turn on their programs and vacuum up the dropped inventory. I don't believe anyone ever expected anything to go wrong in a seemingly harmless game of chance, but often, even in a legit game, things did go wrong. Ping is crucial in Maplestory, and some players looking to execute their movement skills to easily gain others' flashy equips often suffered at the hands of high ping and were unable to loot items in time before the other player could. Many players lost valuable equips, and support was unable to recover these items, which brings me to another topic. Is Nexon aware of this? With how many videos and forum posts there are regarding scams, I'm sure Nexon support was overloaded with inquiries of people trying their hardest to get their items and mesos back. After scouring the first page of Google results, I came across this current post on the support page which explains a small list of common scams and things you can do to protect yourself from falling victim. Interestingly, they call drop game drop trades and tell players there is no guarantee they can retrieve items that have been scammed away, so basically, stop being a silly goose. As far as the 2006 NX cash fraud fiasco, Nexon ended up releasing a series of notices on their website in June of that year, one announcing the disabling of NX cash gifting and one about reporting such fraud. Then, Nexon put out a massive notice on their website in July 2006, which is probably one of my favorite pieces of history that Nexon has attached to it. Let's go through it and highlight a few things. The notice starts off describing the serious infractions of NX cash fraud, going on to explain that this has and will continue to lead to suspensions or permabans. And then immediately, they double down and give reasons as to why these players deserve to be banned. The next couple parts describe the methods used for this fraudulent activity, as well as consequences the company itself will be facing, putting emphasis on major points with big, bold, red text. They also take the time to debunk some rumors of corruptness floating around on Nexon's part. Some people assumed high-level players would be safe from consequences, or that the website's report request notice was some elaborate scheme to trick players into giving Nexon information about who was involved. They pretty much said, well, we're gonna find out anyway, and continued this sentiment with, quote, "Firstly, if you were involved in a resulting fraudulent transaction, you deserve to be banned," followed by, "The ban is inevitable." And let me just say, those were the hardest bars ever dropped in Maple Notice history, and you can't change my mind. Nexon clearly wasn't messing around here, and they went on to address a couple of other topics such as meso farmers, hacking, complaints about GMs, etc. Nexon also makes an interesting comment saying, quote, "Also, do not believe everything that you hear. Many users will claim they got banned for no reason and weave intricate stories with their friends to gain sympathy among the community." I thought that needed to be highlighted because almost 20 years later, people still do this. We see time and time again on various platforms of supposed legit players complaining about being banned, only to find out they used some sort of macro or banned program that is absolutely against TOS. Just something I wanted to go over really quickly. Toward the end, they try to switch the vibe a little with a tiny paragraph about how they passive-aggressively appreciate honest Maplers and ask players to be patient while they fix other concerns. Moving on. In September 2007, Nexon's former director of operations turned CEO, Min Kim, did an article with game developers speaking about things such as the company's revenue and microtransactions, the growth of the company itself, and of course the 2006 scandal. Kim states, quote, "We had to remove lucrative gifting features because people were using it to charge up accounts and items and use them for fraudulent purchases." Interestingly, he also mentions hacking, calling it a drug, and saying, quote, "The hacks were working for players, but they also came with Trojans, which allowed people to drain the user's stash of items in order to sell them." I would assume Nexon would be mostly, if not totally aware of the numerous cheats and scams, but I doubt they would ever do an over-the-top statement again like they have in the past. Overall, I think it's great that Nexon has acknowledged that shady things can and will happen, but ultimately there is no foolproof way of 100% preventing scams from occurring in any aspect of life. All you can do is trust your gut, make good choices, and do not trust anybody that promises to duplicate your 10-attack work gloves or whatever. So that's all I have for you today on Maplestory scams. As stated in the beginning of the video, most of these cons were used in the earlier periods of the game as players were especially gullible, because we really were just kids trying to make an extra 10,000 mesos or become a little more popular. People will always find a way to play the system, but even with the lies and deceit, we still return to the game because the good aspects of the community undoubtedly outweighed the bad. With all that being said, thank you guys so much for watching this video. It took me forever to put together because I have zero experience in YouTube, but I have some stuff planned, and if you have any suggestions, feel free to drop them down below. Thanks again, and see you later, partners.